So this Sunday, down under, we have Tszyu taking on Tony Harrison. This is an interesting fight. I'm sure many of you know that initially Tszyu was supposed to fight in January against undisputed light middleweight champion Jamel Charlo. But Jamel Charlo injured his hand. I think he broke his left hand in preparation for that fight and naturally had to pull out. And rather than taking a back seat for however many months it's going to take for Jamel Charlo's hand to heal, Tszyu decided to take on Tony Harrison, which I think is interesting. Many people are seeing this fight as a potential banana skin. They think that Tony Harrison is potentially going to pull off an upset here, and you know, I wouldn't be shocked. But we're going to break it down. Going to talk about both fighters, talk about how I think the fight is going to go, and we'll come to a conclusion and give a prediction. So starting with Tszyu, of course, the son of a legend in Tszyu. I was very impressed when I first saw Tszyu, which was 2017, I want to say. It was a few years ago. And he impressed me, not because he was particularly athletic. I thought that his hand speed, foot speed, power looked above average, looked decent. What impressed me most about Tszyu was his poise. As a young fighter, I think he must have been in his early 20s at the time I first saw his fight, or the first fight of his I saw. He didn't rush his work at all. Very poised, had some very good technique. He was clearly very well schooled. Technique was very refined, and he was patient with it. He actually looked to set up his shots and did so with plenty of different tools. He had good jab with both hands, good feinting. Positioning looked really good. He wasn't smothering himself. He wasn't out of range to where he's just brushing the target. He had there's a lot of quality there, and he wasn't rushing like what you see a lot of younger fighters do, especially when they've just turned pro. So I found that very impressive, and I'm sure a lot of that was almost to be expected because of who his dad is. I'm sure he played a big role in his tuition and guidance as a boxer throughout the amateurs and as a pro as well. But it was the fact that he was actually able to execute it. It's one thing to know what you're trying to do, but to actually do that effectively was impressive. However, as Tszyu has stepped up the opposition, I've started to become less and less impressed. And that's really been encapsulated in his most recent fight, which was almost a year ago against Tyrell Gachet, where I wasn't particularly impressed. I felt it was a very workmanlike performance against a very game and potentially underrated opponent in Tyrell Gachet. When I watch that fight, I get flashbacks to the first time I watched Tszyu, and I'm just like, where has it all gone? And obviously that is somewhat to be expected, somewhat because of the step up in opposition. The opposition that Tszyu was fighting at the beginning of his career was fairly nondescript, and Tyrell Gachet, not the greatest fighter in the world, but he's been around for a bit. He's earned his stripes. He's a good, solid challenge for a lot of fighters. But Tszyu, he still had that patience, but it was, to the point of being plodding almost, where a lot of the time the fight kind of fell into a pattern of Tszyu not really doing that much at long range. When he was able to get Tyrell Gachet along the ropes, that's where he enjoyed a lot of success, or more success, because he does a good job of using lighter shots with the left and the right hand to set up his power shots in more hooking shots, and he does so quite well because he uses the shots to engage the guard of his opponent, to manipulate it, move them into different positions where a certain shot fits better. And that's one thing that Tszyu does, is he places his shots well. He's not the kind of fighter who's going to waste a lot in terms of power punches. So I guess he still does have that patience and that discipline and that skill, but there are just some other things that are missing. I feel like you could say he's economical with his movement, but it borders on almost being just static and a bit stagnant, where he's getting timed by a fighter like Gachet, who similar size to Tszyu, around 5'10". Actually, maybe a bit taller, I think, but they did look of a similar height, Tszyu and Gachet. But Gachet's jab seemed to be a bit more prominent when he threw it, because Gachet himself is a fighter who has a very crab-like construct. He doesn't really deviate much from his high guard, but he has a good jab, and he timed and actually dropped Tszyu in the first round. Now, it wasn't the heaviest knockdown I've ever seen, but it was a legit clean punch. Tszyu just kind of walked. He was very straight up, I remember. I think he may have even walked into the punch. And yeah, there's just like a kind of static nature to Tszyu, at least at a certain range, that long range especially. As he gets closer and he's able to kind of let his hands go and his work flows a bit better, that's where he's most effective. However, is he going to be able to do that against a fighter like Tony Harrison, who is quite clear he enjoys a significant height advantage, and I imagine reach advantage as well? I don't think Tszyu has the longest reach. And maybe that explains why at long range, at least against better opposition, he doesn't seem to be as active. But Tony Harrison, on the other hand, he's a fighter whose build, I guess you could say, is a lot more suited to fighting at long range. But even he's quite economical with his movement as well. Tony Harrison, I want to say, is a bit more of like a textbook boxer. If you look at his stance and his guard and the punches that he throws, he's very textbook. He's very ordinary. There's nothing that jumps out of you. No special effects. It's really just quite basic, but he does it well because he's quite disciplined, Tony Harrison. Got very good jab. The technique on it is pretty nice, you know. He's very refined. And with that jab especially, he can lead with it as a jab, he can feint it, and he can actually use it as a counter as well. I think when I've watched Tony Harrison, he seems to favour the left jab more than any other punch. And, you know, I think he's listed at 6'1", 76.5-inch reach. Obviously, you know, take that with a pinch of salt, but he gets a lot out of it in terms of maximising it, and he does a good job of slowing the pace of a fight down, especially if you look at that Jermell Charlo fight. Jermell Charlo, not the best boxer at long range, but he's someone who brings a lot of intensity. He has like a wild side to him, Jermell Charlo. But there were long stretches of the first fight especially where Tony Harrison was able to really slow the pace of the fight down. And I rewatched that fight recently, and a lot of the commentary, they were giving a lot of the rounds to Jermell Charlo. And don't get me wrong, it was a close fight, but I felt that Tony Harrison really did more than enough. I felt like, yeah, he was getting clipped. You know, Charlo was having his moments, but I felt Harrison really did a good job of controlling that fight from long range, not really trying to be too adventurous with his offense, relying on the jab, the occasional right hand, sometimes a left hook to the head or the body. Very disciplined, not really trying to be too adventurous, as I say, playing it safe. And, you know, some people don't like that, but ultimately, if you're landing more punches than your opponent, I think it wasn't like Tony Harrison was running. He was right in front of Jermell Charlo. Jermell Charlo just had a hard time landing. So, if we're talking about this fight with Harrison and Tszyu, from what I've seen, the kind of consensus view is Tszyu by KO or Tony Harrison on points. I have to concur with both of those, to be honest. I'd be surprised if Harrison KO'd Tszyu, but then I'd also be surprised if Tszyu did enough to outwork Harrison over the course of a fight to win on points. So I think those are very accurate predictions. They're tough ones. It's a tough one to side either way, though, I have to be honest, because I can see how Harrison wins this fight on points, and if I was a betting man, I probably would put my money on Harrison to win on points. However, I'm not sure if he has the best chin. Um, Harrison can be quite slippery, but if you land on him, at least if you're Jamel Charlo, you know, he was able to get him out of there and actually hurt him a couple times in the first fight as well. But I'm not sure if Tszyu has the size, has the punching power to really expose that in Tony Harrison. I'm sure maybe he doesn't even need that. Maybe Tszyu has enough power to KO Harrison and enough offensive prowess of his own. However, I do favour the long-range boxing, albeit conservative long-range boxing of Tony Harrison. And I think, assuming there's no hometown cooking, because this fight is taking place in Australia, I think Tony Harrison may be able to pull off that upset and get a points win over Tszyu. You know, assuming that it's going to be fair judging, I think it might be a unanimous decision, maybe even by a couple of rounds. But I just think over the course of a 12-round fight, Tony Harrison might just be too active with the jab. Maybe he does get dropped at some point, I don't know. But I just don't think Tszyu's going to be able to get to him consistently enough. I don't think Tszyu is good enough at long range, especially against a guy 6'1", long reach, and really does his best work at long range in Tony Harrison. So that's my prediction for this one, folks. I think that Tony, the Tiger, Harrison gets the points win in Australia over Tszyu. Let me know what you think in the comment section below. Hopefully this is a good fight, first and foremost. Who are you picking and why? Leave it down there and I'll get back to you. Thanks for listening, and I'll catch you in the next video.